And I don't know if this is what's meant by it, but I think of the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah, from Psalm 23. Yeah.
And that, when I'm there in that, to whatever extent, whether it be mild or deep, I've been in both places,
Right.
that I remember that I am the light.
What is, I'm going to have a generic, sort of a generic comment based on the theme that we were talking about, kind of off camera, off speaker, about stages in which we struggle, especially in our younger adult years, still trying to get our footing, getting our solid sense of direction, developing a solid sense of self-integrity, esteem. That doesn't come easily. Sometimes it takes years of struggle. And if we have parents or a parent engaged with us and they take care of things that sometimes are vestiges of mistakes we've made. Let's say I get arrested for doing something stupid with my friends when I was drunk, and my dad has to pay a $2,000 fine, for example. And for a while we are at odds and he's mad at me, and I thought you were on the straight and road. I thought you were leaving wet faces in wet places, but it seems like you're not. I'm disappointed in you. And then 20 years later, when I'm in full recovery and talk about it with a parent, the parent might kind of oversimplify that complex time of struggle and say, yeah, well, I remember when you slipped and you were, again, you got drunk and I had to pay a $2,000 bill, but I'm glad it didn't get worse. Okay, that's part of the truth of the situation. But for me, at the existential throes of what I was really going through, the complexity, the ins and outs, and it seems like a simplistic summary that's almost offensive. Not that it's not true.
Right.
But here's a dilemma. We're not Mr. Spock to do mind melding.
Right.
How I interpret my rich internal experience is always going to be more nuanced and not an either or black and white, but many shades of color, emotional colors. Whereas my parent might see it through the lens of the basic thing that happened.
Sure.
And that's the dilemma always in communication between us human beings, being kind of existentially stuck in our own truth, so to speak. And we can't reveal it fully. We don't even know fully to ourselves what the truth is.
Sure.
The unconscious and the subconscious and the archetypal dynamics, if you're into Jungian psychology. So
sure.
Anyway.
And it's not just parents, though. It's like, we all do that to each other.
Yeah.
Every single being I could see, where it's like of course, we're not going to, I have no need to delve into the richness of the entire experience of what it is to be Olaf. And we sort of tend to pigeonhole each other in a way.
That's right. That's
in
right.
order
That's
to,
well
just to collect the amount of information that we need to go about our lives, really, is what it seems.
Right. And there's no doubt that I have certain pre-biases regarding you, Eric.
Sure.
And those are positive biases. But, but someone else might look at you and say, the Eric you have, Olaf, is not the Eric that I have.
Oh, there's plenty of those people.
So we get stuck in interpretations of each other. And the challenge is to not think that, well, my interpretation of you is the truth. And I am God and I know you. deeply, as you really are. Oh yeah, really?
Right.
How about some humility? But at the same time, we can do more revealing of ourselves to each other through authentic sharing.
Mm-hmm.
But that takes the art of dialogue, of deep listening, compassionate listening, and speaking constructively. Buddhism really emphasizes the idea of empathic, compassionate listening and speaking lovingly, constructively, supportively. That doesn't mean that there isn't room for critique
Right.
and sometimes hard truths. Sometimes we need a kick in the butt, so to speak. But basically, and that concerns me in our society, as many of my colleagues say, in the higher education sphere, do we bother ever to listen to each other anymore?
Right.
Are we attending to each other with compassion and empathy and really listening to each other? Or are we getting so impatient that if you don't tell your truth in 40 words, a TikTok short, TikTok, there's a truth.
Right. That seems to be how it is. I mean, I can say from my own experience, if I'm having a trouble paying attention to somebody or just being sated by the moment, then, it's my head is full of stuff that I'm trying to suppress essentially, or something to that effect. And I'm looking for quick bits of dopamine or quick hits of light as I see it. Something to make me feel good for a moment. But when I have trouble listening to somebody else, it is because I'm thinking about 20 different things.
Oh yeah. That is the number one barrier to deep empathic listening is my mind anticipating and almost syncopating with you. And I'm listening more to myself about what you're saying than really hearing what you're saying. And that gets in the way.
Sure. Now I did prepare something, and maybe we'll get into it, but now there's 20 other things to talk about. All the different thoughts in my head.
Good. So lead on.
Oh, I stopped by a church. I think it was yesterday.
Okay.
And a buddy and I went to a card show. He was looking to get rid of some cards. And it was in a strip mall, and it was at a church, and we met the pastor while we were there. And I should have looked up what denomination it was, but I didn't. But it is about the following the teachings of Jesus, the word of Christ. I think
Baseline Christian group.
Yeah, and very likable fellow, and we had a nice conversation while we were there originally. But my friend stayed in contact with the pastor, and he was invited to a men's meeting the other night, and it just, things sort of lined up, and I felt compelled to go. And I just felt called to go there and see what it was all about. So my friend and I went together, and it was enjoyable. They did a study on Second Timothy, Second Timothy, and which is essentially, it's a letter from Paul, who is about to be killed under Nero's rule, and he's writing to Timothy to tell him to carry on the good fight, essentially, what to focus on. And for me, being that, I've certainly over the years I've been on a spiritual journey, so in that I would look into all sorts of different things and say, oh, finally I found it, or finally I found it over here, or finally I found it over here. But over time, I came to find my own amalgamation of what felt best as I began to form a deeper bond and relationship with, we'll say, God or Creator, the light. And I began to see my own version as opposed to relying on others, because I'm a unique creation in the universe.
Yeah.
And so I see things in a unique way.
Yes.
And I have a unique narrative for it.
Yes.
And so there would have been times, definitely as a younger man, where I would not have been able to sit in a meeting like that. As nice as everybody, let me be clear, everybody there, very likable and wonderful energy about the meeting and everything.
What as a young man would have led you to leave or
not necessarily leave, but fighting in my head.
In your head.
Yeah. And so, as with anything, not just with this type of thing, as with anything, no, that's right. No, that's right. Trying to find the right way to look at things, and in doing that, pushing and pulling against other people's opinions, as a baseline,
or binary or either or thinking.
Yeah. And so instead, what I find at this period in my travels and experience is that I'm able to sit in a meeting like that and find the commonalities underlying whatever narrative is being used to express those things. So I mentioned to you before we got on air about so I can see the baseline is that they are looking towards the light is the way I would put it.
Yeah. And that is, you might say, a core impulse and desire of our spirited soul. We want mental clarity about things. We want to cognitively understand things, how things work, how relationships work, and so on. But, one of the key contrasts in spirituality and the spiritual journey is coming out of darkness into the light. Living in the shadow and then coming to see the light.
Yes, yeah.
And even Platonic philosophy has the same thing. That Plato says most people are like stuck in a cave, are stuck in a cognitive cave, and they see shadows on the cave's wall, and those shadows are reality.
Oh, that quote got me at a period in my life. Yeah, I'm following.
And not realizing that there is a light behind them doing the shadowing, and that you can actually turn around and get out of your cognitive cave toward the light.
Sure.
And toward enlightenment.
Sure.
So, Plato, you might say, had a blend of what we would consider a religious view and a philosophical view. Philosophy and religion have for centuries been interweaved, and that's another discussion we didn't have to get into, but that's why I mentioned Plato. But certainly my own experience in the sacred realm and my own spiritual growth, I would say is about, like you said, seeking enlightenment, coming out of the shadows of my own ego projections and seeing things from beyond the ego and seeing things from the perspective of a spiritually understood, a sacred view of things.
So, it just struck me, side note is, so when because you mentioned philosophy, when it comes to like a fundamentalist Christian thing, because if I continue to feel like I want to go to these meetings, I just want to be as respectful as possible.
Sure.
But with still being able to, speak and engage in a meaningful way. But I don't speak and engage in the same way as they do in that context.
Sure.
So I may have some questions regarding that. And one of them that's coming up right now is that I heard somebody mention something that made me think that, well, I can't remember what the quote was, but so there is the words of Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and that is considered the word of God, correct? To some extent?
Yes.
Okay.
They are considered call it a unity word.
Okay.
It's the sacred speaking in and through Jesus.
So then a mystical perspective of that, or say metaphysics, which I have training in, or, I have training in many disciplines, but beyond, outside of the word of Jesus, those types of ways of looking at things would be the philosophies of man in their perspective. Would that be somewhat accurate?
Yeah.
There's the word of God and the philosophies of man.
Or if there are counter religious systems saying like Buddhism is not theistic, a strict Buddhism doesn't believe in, quote, a God, unquote.
Right.
But does believe in higher consciousness, kind of an intrinsic capacity of human beings to be enlightened and to know the path of compassion,
sure,
of peace, and of non-attachment, which attachment creates suffering, but dedicated to the happiness of others. A lot of people mistake. So, now in my head, can I blend the words of Jesus and the idea of the Buddha? Of course I can. Of course. That's not to say, oh, they're saying the same thing. No. It's narrative resilience, understanding that any narrative system is relative. It is not the absolute. It is a creation of human beings. Now, they may be in concert, meaning they have a shared doctrine, a shared learning, and they all ascribe to it emotionally. Yeah, this I feel is the truth. We don't only say it's the truth, we feel it as the truth. And when they feel it as the truth, they value it deeply, and even self-identity becomes wrapped in that. And on the one hand, that can be a very empowering, good thing, giving people a capacity to be increasingly loving, kind, gentle. I'm referencing the fruits of the Spirit that is talked about in Scripture. But the mistake comes when people in the system say, well, this is it. This is the truth. And if you have a different way of talking about the sacred and about ultimate concerns and ultimate possibilities, you are wrong. You are condemned. You're going to hell or whatever. And that's unfortunate. I believe that in our postmodern world, as you say, we have to accept that there are different narratives. You can listen respectfully, but you also kind of look for a commonality, a baseline commonality, and you felt it in that group that they were seeking the light.
Right.
So, but you had some other things that you maybe wanted to initiate some conversation on.
Oh, I guess that's why I'm shuffling papers. Thank you for. Yeah. Oh, this is something completely different. So throughout, how do I want to say this? Throughout, this is how I came upon it. I'm like a perpetual studier, and I constantly have to be working on. I don't have to be, but I like to be.
You want to be.
I want to be.
Yeah.
I like to. I get a sense of accomplishment from working on degrees and certificates and courses and finishing them out. And so I was working on one particular course to be able to get certified or licensed, and at the end of it, and it was like an intense 2 or 3 days. I came to the end of it, and I know there's plenty of stuff in front of me to do, right? But all of a sudden there's this void that I sort of fell into. And I looked it up, and it's called the liminal space, as far as I can tell.
Okay.
And the way it looks is it's the gap between missions, where I know there's some things, I know there's plenty of goals and things that I need to work on, but everything got a little bit foggy, and no, I wasn't sick or anything at the time. There's this space where I don't know what to do, and it was I don't know what to do next. Maybe it lasted like at least almost a day. I didn't know what the next move was for me. And it coincided with this this detachment from a connection with the divine, where I couldn't see. I couldn't read how I normally can. With I don't know how to say that in a way that relates it properly, people, but I wasn't connected to
became kind of fuzzy or diffused
with God.
Not focused.
My connection to God was not there at that time. Also, except I still get messages in those times.
Okay.
If I'm watching.
Okay.
And one of the messages was, sometimes we get disconnected. That was the message that I heard.
Yeah.
And we just had, and then I'll start getting messages that remind me. Yeah, just the way I say it is that when you're in the darkness, that you remember that you're the light. And I don't know if this is what's meant by it, but I think of the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah, from Psalm 23. Yeah.
And that, when I'm there in that, to whatever extent, whether it be mild or deep, I've been in both places.
Right.
That I remember that I am the light, and this too shall pass, and this is temporary. And the disconnect is not an opportunity for me to go looking to fill the void with TikTok or beer or overindulgence in whatever, but to simply allow that. I guess you could call it suffering for the sake of it, but that discomfort, and so to allow that void, so then and it gives you an opportunity to have faith in what you know to be true already in the times where you are connected.
Right, the void, and then the void creates a sensitivity to the presence.
Right.
Or another way to put it is there are times when we experience the absence of the sacred. Not an absence of the experience of the sacred, but the experience of the absence of the sacred. And that is part of the normal rhythm of faith-based spirit life. Some people distinguish that dynamic. And I like the image of going into the valley, shadows, darkness. And some people might call that via negativa, kind of a more negative time, but trusting the process coming out of the valley to a new field in the sunlight, or a new hill, or even to a new mountaintop.
Sure.
Where there's greater clarity than in the former mountain. Maybe a greater clarity regarding
I like that one.
One's vision, one's call. And David Brooks has a book a few years back on that called The Second Mountain, where he talks about, I think I might have mentioned it in former podcasts, but he mentions how people come to the first mountain of success in our American cultural terms: money, status, BMW, mini mansion, all of the accoutrements of having made it, quote unquote. And then they wonder, why is there a deep dissatisfaction? Why is there, depression, even anxiety? I mean, I've got it made. And then they realize, wait a minute, this is not our life's purpose deeply from a spiritual perspective. So they go back to a valley of sorts, revisiting their assumptions, their goals, their self-understandings, and it becomes can be a confusing time, liminal time. But eventually they begin to climb up the second mountain and come to, you might say, the mountaintop of a more transcendent understanding that I'm not here for me and my self-aggrandizement, but I'm here for a higher purpose that helps humankind, that helps human reality.
Exactly, yep.
Planetary reality, etc. Regardless of whatever field. I may still be a businessman, businesswoman, but I see business so differently in the second mountain, that it's not just profiteering, but it's to help people with products and services that better human living.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a missional aspect. There's an ethical aspect to one's business dealings.
Yeah. Well, I love that image with the mountaintop, because not only do I see what you're going for metaphorically, I've done my fair amount of day hikes in the mountains in my years, and
I'm closest to the sacred.
You'll hit that shorter
yes.
peak, and you just don't want to go down again to go to the next peak, but you have to at the same time.
I know.
So Carl Jung talked about this in the process of individuation.
Right.
He called it the night sea journey.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Where after great effort, and this is what I really connected to. Okay, the ego loses its sense of direction and must surrender to the unconscious or divine before new meaning emerges. And I think that becomes more true. There's subtleties of that with each successive peak throughout your evolutionary journey, let's say. But as you continue on, the ego slowly loses its footing.
Yeah.
And there is really a time, I feel, when because the ego is very clearly knows that it is down and out, there's a period where it feels like nobody's running the show.
Okay.
Where the ego's like, are you sure you want me to go? I'm not supposed to come up with the next thing to do anymore, because nobody seems to be taking charge around here. And that can be this very confusing time where in my experience, it takes time to gain trust in that time, that you're not filling it with all the overindulgences, just trying to get a feel good feeling for a second, or I get lost in the void.
One of the baseline features of living in the faith, which means living with a sense of meaningful participation in the sacred sphere, the sphere of spirit, and being connected meaningfully to the transcendent, to the divine, if you will, to the sacred. That does involve de-egoizing our lives. The challenge is we need our ego consciousness. By way of my ego consciousness, I got here. Ego consciousness, drove my car here.
Right.
It's the functional consciousness that by which we negotiate the tasks of life. And so we cherish that ego. That ego protects us, moves us forward, helps us to get done what we think is important to get done, prevents us from doing harm to ourselves and others, etc. But it's one thing to operate functionally with ego, that one's ego becomes one's God.
Right. Yeah. That's a wonderful way to put it. Yeah.
One's divinity reference, my way or the highway. And the ego can become religified. And this gets tricky. people can have very egoized religious convictions.
Right.
It's my Jesus. And if you don't ascribe to my Jesus, then you're going to hell. You're off. You have this liberal Jesus? What? Jesus was a Jew and a justice prophet? Are you kidding me? You know, he's the high priest who sacrifices blood for my sins and I'm saved. What is all of this, other stuff? Come on. Come on. Okay, you have Jesus as your devotional figure, as Thomas More says it in his book, one of his books, The Soul's Religion. That's the title of the book. The book that put him on the map was The Care of the Soul, Thomas More. He blends psychology and spirituality and theology. And in the book, The Soul's Religion, he says, Jesus is a devotional figure that enhances a person's understanding of divinity in their lives and gives them a faith reference. Am I being like Jesus? Am I being compassionate? Am I being caring? Am I being forgiving? Am I being reconciling? You look at the stories, the gospel stories of Jesus, what he said and did. You can't help but come to certain conclusions, and especially when you look at Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers, for they are considered daughters and sons of the sacred, the peacemakers. And Matthew 25, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is quoted to say, if you feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick, and visit prisoners, you are right in line with Abba, with the sacred. The sacred is in effect acting through you, and we are one, Matthew 25. But that is, we go beyond the ego into a guided flow, let God, let flow, that kind of thing. It sounds so cliche, but my experience day in and day out is the sense of companionship, partnership, and apprenticeship with the sacred.
Sure.
Really, and so it's more like we than me. But I'm not pretending that, I'm God. But in some sense, when you look at Jesus the Christ as a paradigm for being human, as he was mystically tied with the Creator, whom he used the nickname Abba, interchanged also with Amma. You can argue that both, Father, Mother, God are appropriate, as scholarship reveals. So even our doing this together, this podcast experiment, I call it, to me, has a sense of witness with the sacred purpose. You and I share a sense that, hey, let's put it out there. And if it's valuable to a few people, a few listeners, and if they get something from it that helps them to understand themselves as a spiritual being, not just as a body being and a psychic being, but we are an embodied psychic spiritual being. And hey, and if it makes a positive difference in any listener's lives, especially in terms of de-egoizing themselves, get out of Plato's cave. In other words, are you living more by the shadows that you need and want and think that's it?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you willing to turn toward the light and see more directly the possibilities in connection with the sacred presence for you?
Yes. So
a lot of words.
No, that's good. Maybe I need to start taking notes while you're talking. So, a couple of things that I do anyways. When a couple of things that I do anyways. when I'm in those dark moments, I wouldn't maybe call them dark moments, disconnected,
sure.
unfocused moments.
Sure.
Would be the way to say it.
Right.
Is that to the extent that I can, first of all, not be hard on myself about it. That just makes everything worse, or beat myself up. That's definitely been par for the course, not recently necessarily, but over the course of my lifetime. And I'll say, I can focus on my food, my food intake, going for walks, exercising, doing some sort of studying. In the interim, I'm looking to improve myself. And stay away from, filling myself with garbage to try and become sated.
Yep, me too.
That's not always necessarily easy. Sometimes I'll get like down in a hole about it, or won't have the energy to exercise per se.
Sure.
But that's one of the things, and or going for drives is pretty good for me.
Okay.
Yeah, I like going for drives, or I'll go out to like this time of year. I'll go out to Anchor Bay. It's frozen, so I can drive the truck out there and go for a little walk on the frozen tundra. Right on the bay.
The frozen? Oh.
Yeah. Can drive the big old F-250 out there. 7,500 pounds of truck on the ice.
Okay. Yeah, I assume you know how to read the ice.
Yeah.
To know that it's good to drive the truck on versus
Bring my reading glasses and everything.
You might be like a Jonah, suddenly getting swallowed up by the water, but you're not in a whale. You're in a 150 truck, and the water is all around you.
250. Can't call it 150.
250. Oh my goodness.
So you're not driving way out into the middle of the bay.
Yeah.
It's 7 miles across, but you're not driving way out in the middle of that. You're going out a couple blocks, a couple thousand feet.
That reminds me of, I love the feeling of being in nature, but I'm not a naturalist who wants to live 24 hours in nature. I'm sort of 12 hours in nature and then get me to a motel, to a nice bed, to a nice shower,
Right.
And then 12 hours back in nature,
Sure.
But, when you spoke about, a 7-mile lake, the image that came to mind was speed skating on a clear Michigan lake in the wintertime. Oh my goodness. I can remember a couple of times I was able to do that.
Okay.
And just speed away.
Yeah.
Without other people around, and walls, and, it's almost like infinity, many miles from one edge of a lake to another. And I never liked hockey skates for some reason, but I love speed skates.
Well, we used to play, I got my family's hockey family.
Okay.
So me and my dad played, me and my brother played, my brother definitely more than me. His kids played. So we lived on a lake and we would play hockey out there any year that we could, it was definitely frozen more often than it is nowadays when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But now, but it wasn't every year. You couldn't go out there.
Sure.
There's a few times we fell through, as a matter of fact. These are little ponds. It's not really a lake, little like subdivision ponds. Yeah, but that was fun. That's so I know the feeling of just like when you can we got a good big patch of ice and you can just take off across it. That's the greatest thing.
Yeah. The fact is, human beings hunger for alternate consciousness states. There's something to be said about our working ego consciousness being in the tyranny of the routine. We live in kind of a certain tracks that we have to live. I have to drive to work. I have to do my job in this way and that way. I have to drive back. We live in the tyranny of routines. Maybe that's kind of over dramatized, but I think anyone listening can relate to that. We have this deep desire for alternate consciousness, to experience mentality differently, with a different thrust, energy, different feeling. And that's why we pay comics a lot of money, because laughter is the best medicine. Laughter is a state of consciousness and energy that is so, gets us out of ego constructs.
Sure.
Out of a cave, so to speak.
Yeah.
Almost like dancing and laughing at the light. But that also is the impulse toward drugging and drinking. Artificial, externalized ways of having alternate consciousness.
Yeah.
And the thing about the mystical spiritual traditions of every major faith system, they all are about the experiential alternate consciousness of living in tune with the sacred spirit.
Yes.
In other words, alternate consciousness does not require drugs and drink and the externals. We have, in relationship to the sacred dimension, we have natural ways of shifting into alternate forms of consciousness. And music does that for us. Music is so inherently spiritual. And I experienced the Grammys a week back, on 2 Sundays back. And people agreed it was one of the best Grammys ever. The performances were excellent and powerful. And all brands and forms of music, from country to hip hop to folk, and of course one of my favorite jazz pianists, his name eludes me at the moment, played with Stevie Wonder, doing harmonica, and then Stevie Wonder singing, and there is a book in my field of theology, which I've mentioned before, that says the sacred spirit uses the arts to humanize us according to the kind of humanity that the sacred desires us to be. Music draws us to harmonization, to alternate forms of consciousness. Music, draws us together. And a friend of mine sent a picture on the phone, Facebook, of a rock star in a mall starting to play guitar and sing a song with just a friend beside him, just he singing and playing. And before you know it, a few other people came with their instruments. A saxophonist joined, a guy with a bass, another guitarist, and people and shoppers started gathering around, and eventually started singing. And that to me was just such an anecdote of the inherent spiritual power of the arts to draw us toward a higher connectivity, an artistic, spirited, spiritual connectivity, that unfortunately doesn't happen enough. It can, but it doesn't happen enough because there are too many ego-oriented powers in charge, that it's my way or the highway. Only my perspective counts. What I don't like, America cannot like either. What I prefer, America also will prefer. Or my whatever. The domination of the ego that presumes to be above the sacred. In other words, my ego is a capital E. My ego is God.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, and the way I really like to think about that last part is how you get the light, and it's sort of loosely based on a Kabbalistic perspective. I'm not quoting Kabbalah, but is that when you put a God before the creator or your source, then you're looking. That's the same as you're like looking for temporary fixes in order to feel good, to feel that divine presence.
Yeah.
But they're ones that you can't keep, and even with regards to, for instance, hallucinogens, is that you can get that that taste of being with the divine, but even after that, it seems as if the vessel sort of shrinks a little bit, and you get a little bit less than you had before you started.
That's the danger of hallucinogens. They can assist the experience of connectivity, but we know that the dynamic of addiction is the second time is not exactly quite as good as the first time. So we want to replicate that initial, virginal experience. And we seek more and more and more to try to get back to that first experience.
Well, yeah. Oh, there's no doubt. That's true of all ways of stealing light, so to speak.
Yeah, I like that expression.
Stealing the light.
Stealing the light.
It's a light you can't keep.
Idolatry does that. A substitute for a higher power. For a true, you might say, sacred higher power. But
it does. I mean, I don't want to put it down, because it does help you, in my experience, form neural pathways.
Okay.
So that you know the way to get there.
Okay.
And it can be assistive in that way.
And in your experience, did that help you to get on that way without the assistance?
Yes, absolutely.
You see that? Yeah. That's when it's working. When it's working rightly. Yeah. And I confess that all of my studies and doctoral work and all of that kind of stuff, has not looked into hallucinogens and that whole dynamic in relationship to spirit, psyche, body. I defer to those who really know it, and I defer to the experts. And I know there's kind of a revival of late with cognitive science increasing and cognitive psychology, neural psychology. Some people are looking into, mushrooms, for example, or whatever, hallucinogens to assist people, as you say so well, to develop neural pathways, that, and hopefully they open pathways that don't depend on continuing the hallucinogenic system, but open the pathways to naturally continue.
It does. It has generative effects in that way of forming new pathways in your mind.
Okay.
But from my subjective experiences, I mean, for me, it wasn't. I have always sort of sought out that type of divine, what's behind the veil connection.
Sure.
So it's not that I didn't have that at all previously, and it was more. The reason I took it is to get rid of the noise. And when you take hallucinogens, they will tell you all about what's wrong with you. And so it's sort of like a test, especially mushrooms. And I've never really done that much. But mushrooms will put your deeper underlying issues right in your face, is how they work.
Now, Carlos Castaneda, what did he use? Peyote, huh?
I think... it's been a minute since I watched some Carlos Castaneda, but I think it seems to me like it was peyote.
I believe so, but again, not having studied that, only reading about his experience.
Yeah.
I can't speak meaningfully except to say, I respect him in how he describes spiritual experience, and I call it the naturalistic dimensions of the spirit. That the sacred spirit is not dependent on religions to impart influence on human beings. I'm not saying religions can't impart the dynamics of the sacred spirit. Indeed, if a religion is working well, it does that. I teach leadership. Faith community leadership is one of my teaching assignments in the Graduate School of Theology and Ministry that I part-time teach at, being a semi-retired professor. And there's a book on, that talks about faith community leadership, 21 purposes of what a faith community is really about. And the very first purpose of a faith community is spiritual formation. Right from the get-go, it's about helping people to open up their pathways of their heart, their mind, their spirit, to the presence formation of the sacred, as that faith system might understand the sacred. Yes.
Yeah.
Spiritual formation.
You're right. Well, what I guess I was trying to say is that my thing with hallucinogens was mainly just to get past whatever was in my way of. I could feel there was blockages in mental blockages to be able to get to that divinity that I was get to the light within my consciousness and that's the same reason I used alcohol actually.
It
was to suppress the pain that numbed everything else.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And part of mature spiritual living is to accept the fact of suffering.
Yeah.
Suffering one's own limitations, suffering what comes with being a compassionate, empathic, justice-oriented, loving human being. You are going to suffer.
Yes. Well, yeah, you got to get to that point, and you have to realize there's other ways out.
Discussion, But can you articulate retrospectively what those blocks were? You were aided by hallucinogen to kind of get beyond the blocks to more spiritual illumination or awakening.
Well, okay. Well, if you want to encapsulate it into a word, it's unworthiness. And so now when I talk about anything like this, there is no like poor me about it. I am all about whatever obstacles that I came in with, and this was definitely one of them. Let's say I co-created it. It's probably the best one. Is like God and I sat down together and said, "Hey, what's the best way to get me to the next level, God?" And we're like, "Okay, deep-seated unworthiness."
Okay.
And that played itself out in many, many ways. So I think at first I definitely used it as a social elixir. And that would have been what started it, because I couldn't even function at certain points. And by the time, I was late teens, you start gaining more confidence, and I was working good, hard jobs, and I gained confidence at that point. But by that time, that was already too late. I was hooked.
Right.
So so that's what it helped with.
Well, I asked again, can you retrospectively, articulate the blocks that you got beyond or through in, the spiritual practice of being aided by hallucinogen for a bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, to finish that question then is because I've boiled it down to unworthiness, but when you got something like that going on and you have no idea how to solve it, it's just that's how it is. That's how life was set up for you from birth. Then there is that sort of fate is laid in.
Yeah.
There's choices along the way, but there's a sort of fate there.
Mm-hmm.
And things you collect other things. I've heard it called a gestalt, that over time you collect more things.
That's right.
That prove to you that originating thing. And that would be the unworthinesses. And and so then my thoughts and my emotions and my behaviors all went to support that originating thing. And so, I mean, I don't want to get lost in the weeds on specifics,
right?
But that would be it's years and years of, even though you're kind of getting a clue in life. Like, okay, so like I said, I started working early, 13 years old. So by the time I was 17, I was running a crew, building swimming pools, and that there's you get healthy, you gain confidence, you're out in the sun, you start looking good, and there's still so you can kind of almost fake it in a way at that point, but there's still underlying things,
of course,
that like you can only fake it so far. So you have to go back down the mountain, like you said, and go up to the next peak. And it cannot be wonderful. And it can look to you, the people that know you, like you're regressing in a way.
Okay.
And when well, sometimes that's the case, but you're still moving forward in a way. You're still moving forward. And
in parallel terms to your, like a Venn diagram, if I look at the complexity of blockages, the word that seems to summarize it all, like you said, like a gestalt, is unworthiness. In my case, it was the block of a sense of inadequacy, not being good enough, and looking for like substitutions, reading and quoting people as almost like a substitute for me, for sharing my thought. Not trying to impress people with these quotes, but more like hiding behind them. And eventually, through many different systems and approaches, especially the spiritual model of healing and growth called the Enneagram. 9 points. Ennea is the Greek word for 9. Ennea.
Okay.
And it's, I'm not going to get into it, but it's a complex, clear model of the spiritual journey that all humans go through. And the originating source comes from Sufi mysticism, picked up by other people and eventually coming by way of Catholic retreat centers to America. The Enneagram, and a psychologist named Rizzo, that's his last name, I think it's Zizio, can't think of his first name. He psychologized the Enneagram. He kind of took it out of the, just the realm of spiritual words or concepts, but put it into the psychological. And that, bringing it to the element of psychological application and clarity, really helped me. And he called it the neurotic side of the numbers. And by that Enneagram, you have numbers to indicate the basic type you are, but where you are moving from and toward. So the 5, which I am, is a thinker. But the neurotic side of the 5 is my thoughts aren't good enough. How I think is inadequate. And so what happens then, according to Rizzo, is, in which I did, you feed, you feed on others. Like I said, you quote others, you feed others ideas, becomes like a substitute for me because I'm not good enough to share concept. This might come from my own convictions or my own experience. So there's a derivative sense And ironically, it kept me stuck. It kept me stuck until I understood the dynamic of the sense of inadequacy. Yeah.
Well, the wonderful thing that I'm thinking about that these senses of inadequacies cause is like you end up with a superpower afterwards. Because, so for instance, I can relate, that I had a terrible inability to share my ideas in almost any setting, one-on-one, a small group, forget a stage, Actually, a stage would probably be the least of my worries, to be honest. For some reason, I could be on a stage okay. But
this thespian, you psych, huh?
Yeah, something about it is, I know what it was. It's not something about it. It's the fact that nobody was going to interrupt me, and I knew that it was my turn to talk, and I knew that this is what I was supposed to be saying, and it was okay to say it. And so, so the point is that now at this point, because I had such trouble with that, now you go to a small group and you're the first person to talk, and there's not a difficulty in your noodle about it.
Yeah.
But you can see other people, actually the vast majority of people, struggling with the same thing that you had trouble with.
Sure.
Yeah. And so it turns into a superpower. So you can both empathize and not have that same difficulty.
Right. Yeah. It's and of course, when one is meaningfully connected with the sacred presence and the sacred dynamic in our human sphere, instead of feeling unworthy, what it creates is a deep sense of worthiness. And in Christian parlance or the Christian narrative, the essence of human worthiness is that one is considered to be a daughter and son of the sacred. The Christ paradigm has the sacred creator saying, "You are my child." And I say the Christ paradigm applies to every human being. You are my child. The sacred doesn't just create us and say, "Oh, you're a bot, here a bot. Eric is a bot, Olaf is a bot, they're a bot, they're a bot." No.
Everywhere a bot.
Yeah, everywhere a bot. Every human being is a special sacred vessel of inherent worthiness because of the commitment of the creator. But because the creator is love, it can't be imposed.
Right.
We are not Pinocchios. We are not puppets on the sacred string. We are created in such a way that we can say no to the creator. No. I have my idols. I prefer those. No. I don't believe. I don't relate. It's an extraordinary freedom. It's like a parent can love a child and says, "Get away, Dad. Get away, Mom. You're not in my life. I hate you."
I don't know if it's you I discussed this with, but somewhere I came up with the idea. I never thought of it like this. Is that, so free will is the fact that you can turn away from the creative light, which doesn't in the end turn out so good. There
are consequences.
And so in the end, you kind of get sick of the consequences. And so, which I think we can see not just in me as an individual, I think we can see it culturally and in many individuals. And so you kind of turn back towards the light, to the extent that you're aware of that for wherever you are, wherever you're at. But okay, so this is the point, is that at that point, you kind of lose your sense of free will in a way. Because now you don't have the choice to turn away. You're not, I guess you could still choose to turn away, but it's almost an illusory choice. Does that make sense?
Maybe conceptually it does. I'm processing, the dynamic of it, the operant energetic dynamics of it.
Because you go through, and you're actually you're almost learning to give your free will away. That is a spiritual journey in a manner of speaking. And maybe I don't think it's a dark way of saying it. I think it might be an honest way of saying it.
I guess what I experience is, and what I read in other, mystical writings, is a co-willing. It isn't like an either or, well, thy will or mine. But a co-willing, and that's a delicate matter, because that you might be fooling yourself. I might be fooling myself and thinking, God wills this with me.
Oh, sure.
But I've had too many powerful experiences that, to validate that expression, the co-willing. And one of the marks of the mystical Jesus talked about in the Gospel of John, according to Bishop Spong, who wrote a book on the mystical Jesus in the Gospel of John, after he did 5 years of deep textured research on the Johannine Gospel, its background and what is it really saying, and so on and so forth. And that mystical tie to the sacredness is a paradigm for every human being. And so there is, like, when Jesus is quoted in the Gospel of John, I and the Father are one. That is a sense of co-willing.
Mm-hmm.
So when I look at the human Jesus, and to me, that is very important, the full humanity of Jesus. He really is struggling in midnight in Gethsemane, goes to that rock, a dramatic, fearsome moment of realizing that if I continue to follow Abba's will, it's going to be a path of horrific suffering. He knew that. Take this cup from me, Abba. Take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours. So it indicates that there is, even though, there is a co-willing, there is also at the same time a separation dynamic. It's not an either or, but both and. And the symbol of the yin and yang does a good job of being both but also separate.
Mm-hmm.
So, it takes a deeper discernment. You might say, at the end of the day, did I operate more from ego and my will in certain ways? And there's hardly a day where I can say, no, not at all.
Certainly.
When
I talk about taking your free will, it occurred to me, it's amazing the things we forget in the moment, but it occurs to me what the definition of you is. If you're identifying yourself with the ego self, then yes, you're definitely losing your free will. You're giving it away.
Yes.
And because you're becoming something more, you're sort of shedding that shell. And it seems to me that it is that it is that the divinity wishes to walk unencumbered on earth using this vessel, but it takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
And that's what that is cracking through that shell of the ego.
Yeah.
And so
you live trans egoistically.
Yeah.
And
so in line with that, when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, and I know it's non-canonical, but I don't care, but it found in the, what is it called? The Nagamati, the 1945 stuff that was found in Egypt, like Thomas, the book of Thomas, for instance, when he says the kingdom of God is all around you, in you and all around you. Yeah. These are, you know, observations, invocations, and affirmations. Is you're calling forth and recognizing what God already knows. But you're affirming it within yourself and saying that I know this on earth as you do in heaven, so to speak.
Right. And
and I'm one with you in that realization, in that recognition. Yeah.
I'm a little bit time sensitive today because I will be going to talk about philosophy to a Socratic meeting. It's the Socrates Club.
Oh.
It's a group of scholarly people, most of whom are in higher education, not necessarily so, but scholarly people. And one of the scholars, Dr. Mark Witters, who teaches interreligious studies at Eastern Michigan University. He's a great human being, a great scholar, and he is doing a paper for the Eastern Orthodox contingent, doing a paper for their annual conference called the Orthodox Sophia Conference. And Sophia is spirit. You know, the Eastern Orthodox consciousness is very much, key on this idea of living in the sacred spirit and the sacred spirit living in us. And Mark has written a wonderful, like 18-page paper on the book of Hebrews, how different schools of interpretation and thought have approached the book of Hebrews. But the thrust of the paper is the epistemology of faith consciousness. What is the character of faith consciousness, as opposed to our typical operant cognitive consciousness as human beings, where, is faith consciousness of different quality and different character than deductive and inductive reasoning, for example. Science is based on inductive reasoning with empirical validation. Well, does faith also operate that way, by inductive reasoning and empirical validation? Can you and I validate empirically a lot of things we talk about? No. But can we validate it experientially?
Yes.
And can people listening to us, if they tune into their hearts, their souls, their interior process, kind of get what we're talking about? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's why I always...
And that enriches life when you get that.
Absolutely. That's why I always love the words, don't take my word for it. Just look within yourself and validate it there.
Right.
But it's a pointing. It's like, this is what I see. Right. What do you see over there?
Yeah. And where the early interpreters go with the book of Hebrews is, yes, there can be a cognitive understanding of it, inductively, deductively, but when you get to a deeper spiritual understanding, you go to a different kind of epistemology. In other words, a different kind of knowing and consciousness.
Gotcha. Awesome. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.